oral questions. Question orale, the Honourable Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Finance Minister promised 1 million jobs by the end of June. Well, here we are at almost the end of June, and the numbers are painting a very different picture. 300,000 jobs lost in the last 2 months because of the Liberal vaccine failure. While in other countries like the US and the UK, economies are roaring back, here, Canadians continue to live locked down at home without a paycheck and continuing to see their savings emptied. Mr. Speaker, when will the Liberals finally release a detailed plan to reopen our economy and get Canadians back to work?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, if the Conservatives want to talk about the economy, let's talk about the economy. As of May 2021, over 2.4 million of the 3 million jobs lost at the peak of the pandemic, 8 in 10 have already been recouped. And Mr. Speaker, on April 26th, S&P reaffirmed Canada's AAA rating. And just last week, Moody's also reaffirmed our AAA rating. Our plan is sustainable, responsible, and it's working.
The Honourable Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, does that member not look around and see businesses shut down across the country? This Liberal third wave has brought our economy to a halt. While Canada bleeds jobs, the U.S. job numbers continue to climb. In the last month alone, the U.S. created 500,000 jobs, almost double what we lost. The fact is, Canadians actually shouldn't take this Liberal government seriously. After all, we can see the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister are more focused on planning their travel itineraries than getting Canadians their freedoms back and getting them back to work. Isn't that the truth?
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the member opposite for giving me another opportunity to discuss our government's growth plan and how it is working for Canadians. Mr. Speaker, as I'm sure the member opposite saw last Friday, Statistics Canada released their Q1 GDP number, and it's good news. The economy grew at an annual rate of 5.6% in the first quarter of the year, much better than predicted 3.6% growth for Q1 in the budget. Budget 2021 is a growth budget that will deliver for Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
It's very sad to see the Liberals so out of touch with the suffering that Canadians are going through. Canadians are running out of hope and they're running out of money. The Liberals have had months to plan a roadmap to get our economy back on track, but they failed to act. The U.S. has a 42% vaccine rate where their total population has been vaccinated. Ours, 7.6%. Let's be real, the Liberals have failed on all fronts, and it's Canadians who are paying the price. Why can't these Liberals give Canadian families and businesses some certainty and present a clear plan to end the lockdowns so Canadians can get back to work?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me be perfectly clear that our government will always stand up to Canadians, workers, and families. We have supported and helped maintain over 5.3 million Canadian jobs through the wage subsidy, and our government intends on extending that vital program through next summer. And Mr. Speaker, in Budget 2021, we announced we would introduce the Canada Recovery Hiring Program to support eligible employers by providing subsidies to offset a portion of the costs during the reopening and hiring of more staff. We know there is still much more work to do, and our government will continue to support Canadian workers and families.
The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, one way to have an economic recovery is to get Canadians back to work, but that's not happening. According to the statistics, 68,000 jobs were lost last month. That's 3 times worse than what was forecast. Mr. Speaker, what is the government's plan to get Canadians back to work? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member opposite for giving me another opportunity to discuss our government's growth plan and how it will work for Canadians. As the member has obviously seen, StatsCan published on Friday GDP figures for the first quarter, and it's good news. The economy has grown at an annual rate of 5.6% in the first quarter of the year, which is much higher than the 3.6% forecast in the budget for the first quarter. Budget 2021 is a growth budget which will benefit all Canadians. The honourable member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, we're talking about jobs, getting people back to jobs. Canadians want to earn a paycheck, and that's not what's happening, Mr. Speaker. In the U.S., 500,000 new jobs were created. 68,000 jobs were lost in Canada over the same period. Its employment levels are 3% below pre-pandemic levels. But Canadians who should be at work are still at home. What is the government's plan to get Canadians back to work? The Honourable Minister.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker, allow me to be perfectly clear. Our government will always stand up for Canadian workers. We've taken steps to protect 5.3 million jobs through the emergency wage subsidy. And what's more, Mr. Speaker, in Budget 2021, we announced the introduction of the hiring program to encourage employers by providing subsidies to cover some of the reopening and rehiring costs. We know that there's still a lot to be done, and that is why our government will continue to support workers and Canadian families. The honourable member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, Quebec wants to apply Bill 101 to federally regulated businesses in order to protect French as a language of work. But the minister keeps telling us she wants to extend the scope of the Official Languages Act instead. Except the Official Languages Act doesn't protect French, it protects bilingualism. But get this, Mr. Speaker, Quebec is not bilingual. Quebec is French, and French is in decline. And they know this. What's the minister going to do? Use Bill 101 to protect French, or use the Official Languages Act to promote bilingualism instead? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I agree with my colleague that French is in decline in Quebec and all across the country, and obviously we want to do more to protect our beautiful French language. We, too, wish to recognize that Quebecers and Francophones living in heavily French areas elsewhere in Canada have the right to work in French. They need to be served in French. They shouldn't be discriminated against. And the interpreter points out that there's interference on the line. So we will move ahead with modernizing the Official Languages Act. I'd like to remind members joining us in hybrid fashion or virtually to turn their mics off because this is causing problems. We want to make sure we understand both the questions and the answers. The honourable member for La Prairie. Quebecers don't want just the right to work in French. They want French to be the language of work. There's a distinction to be made there. Quebec is not bilingual, it's French. The federal government is bilingual, and at the federal level, Francophone public servants say they're uncomfortable working in their own language. According to the Commissioner of Official Languages, it's not an inclusive culture, and French often becomes a language of translation. In fact, the federal government takes first place every year for complaints about non-compliance with the Official Languages Act. Who would want to extend that model to Quebec rather than apply the Charter of the French language to federally regulated workplaces? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, we want to do more to protect French and institutional bilingualism in government. And that's why in our reforms, we want to give the Commissioner greater powers. We want there to be a central body that ensures that official languages are respected. And ultimately, we want to extend the Official Languages Act to private companies under federal jurisdiction. That will be the first time that the Official Languages Act will apply to the private sector. And I think that's a huge step forward for Francophones and Francophiles in Canada. And obviously, we will work with the government of Quebec to ensure. The honourable member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. 215 is the number of voices forced to remain silent forever. 215 now stands for the innocents wiped out by cruelty and racism. 215 is unfortunately only the beginning. We're only just beginning to grasp the full extent of the gaping wounds caused by Canada's genocidal actions. The Prime Minister can no longer hide behind crocodile tears and lofty rhetoric. If he says he understands the suffering of Indigenous people, he should stop dragging residential school survivors into court today. Will he vote in favour of our motion, yes or no? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, we support a number of aspects of the motion, but jurisdictional issues are complex and there are privacy considerations as well. These can't be solved unilaterally. As our government has said, people affected by inequalities in the treatment of children, they will get fair and just compensation.
Prime Minister's record on First Nation children. He was found guilty of, quote, willful and reckless discrimination against Indigenous kids. He's ignored 19 non-compliance orders and spent over $9 million on lawyers. Yet this weekend he was saying, hey, I'm not in court fighting any First Nation kids. In reality, his lawyers are arguing that children who suffered reckless discrimination are not eligible for any compensation whatsoever. That's their argument. Children have died on this government's watch. When is this Prime Minister going to end his toxic legal war against Indigenous kids?
The Honourable Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me be crystal clear. Children that have suffered discrimination at the hands of the First Nations child welfare system will receive fair, equitable, and just compensation.
I just want to remind the honourable members that heckling is not parliamentary, especially during virtual. I'll ask the minister to answer his question again before he was interrupted.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Prime Minister has said time and time again, as this government has said time and time again, we want to be crystal clear. Every First Nation child that has suffered discrimination at the hands of the failed child welfare system will receive just, fair, and equitable compensation.
Honourable Member for Abbotsford.
Over the weekend, we learned the Finance Minister surrendered Canada's ability to set its own tax rates. We strongly support efforts to make multinationals pay their fair share. But that should never mean giving up sovereignty over our own tax system. The global minimum tax might be great policy for large economies, but
I'm going to interrupt the honourable member. We're having some troubles. J'aimerais rappeler à tout le monde.
I'd like to remind everyone to turn their mics off, to put them on mute.
Is on mute. The honourable member for Abbotsford, if you can take it from the top. Thank you.
over the weekend, we learned the Finance Minister surrendered Canada's ability to set its own tax rates. We strongly support efforts to make multinationals pay their fair share, but that should never mean giving up sovereignty over our own tax system. The global minimum tax might be great policy for large economies, but it's bad for an economy like ours that is struggling to compete with countries like the US. Doesn't the minister realize that our global minimum tax has worsened our ability to compete on the world stage?
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we are focused on protecting Canadian businesses and Canadian workers who lose out to multinational businesses that don't pay tax. If the Conservatives believe that big multinational companies should continue to be exempt from tax, they should say so and be honest with Canadians. In 2019, we campaigned on taxing large digital companies, and that is precisely what we will deliver on, as we detailed it in the budget. And the developments at the G7 Finance Ministers meeting last week will make sure that Canadians are no longer disadvantaged by big corporations shifting profits offshore so they can escape taxation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Abbotsford.
Canadians alone, not the G7, should determine our domestic tax policy. The global minimum tax is long on promises and short on detail. With this Liberal government, the devil is always in the details. So how will the government support startups and other small businesses with lower tax rates? How will this government fulfill its promise to reduce taxes on green and clean tech companies? To the minister, Will this government seek Parliament's approval before imposing a global minimum tax on Canadians?
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our government has and will always stand up for Canadian businesses and workers from all sectors. And let's be clear what this agreement means for Canadians. It will make sure that Canadians are no longer disadvantaged by big corporations shifting profits offshore so they can escape taxation. We are focused on protecting Canadian businesses and Canadian workers who lose out to multinational businesses that don't pay tax. And again, Mr. Speaker, if the Conservatives believe that big multinational companies should continue to be exempt from tax, they should say so and be honest with Canadians. Thank you, Mr.
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, the Minister's answers show that she knows nothing about the situation because the Government of Canada has lost all credibility internationally. The Prime Minister has apparently agreed to let other G7 countries set Canada's tax policy. Not only has Canada already bowed down to China, it's now bowing down to the rest of the world. Why is this Prime Minister making deals that will put Canada at a disadvantage to other world powers? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, we are focused on protecting Canadian businesses and workers who are at a disadvantage relative to multinationals that don't pay any taxes. And if the Conservatives feel that this is the wrong approach, they should be honest and say so to Canadians. We are taking action to tax these web giants. And at the G7 Ministers of Finance meeting, what we did will ensure that Canadians are no longer disadvantaged in this way by multinationals who transfer their profits abroad before they're taxed. The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. As I said, this government's credibility is gone. They're incapable of defending Canada's economic interests. A clear example of this incompetence is Canadian softwood lumber. The U.S. Department of Commerce has announced its intention to double the duties on Canadian softwood. 76,000 workers in Quebec stand to lose even more. More than 2,000 days have passed since the Prime Minister committed to negotiate a new deal. Still nothing 6 years later. When will the Prime Minister take his role seriously and stand up for Canadian forestry workers? The Honourable Minister.
We will always stand up for Canada's forestry workers. They employ hundreds.
L'Honorable Ministre.
Excusez-moi. Can you hear me now?
We're good. Go ahead. You're back on mute again. I'm not sure what happened.
Okay.
Very
Trying
good.
it again.
We'll take it from the top.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to assure the honourable member and Canadians in the forestry sector that we will always stand up for them and the hundreds of thousands of workers that they employ across communities in the country. Let me begin by saying that we unequivocally the duties against Canadian softwood lumber by the U.S. are unjustified and they hurt workers on both sides of the border. I've raised this issue at every opportunity with the President, with the USTR, as well as with the Commerce Secretary. Our government will continue to work on this issue. We will vigorously defend our softwood lumber industry and our workers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Mr. Speaker, the U.S. Commerce Department announced it intends to double Canadian softwood lumber duties. This will be devastating to our forestry sector and further increase costs for Canadians due to our integrated market. The last negotiated agreement by Conservatives expired in 2015. The Prime Minister promised then to have a new softwood agreement within 100 days of taking office. It has been over 2,000 days and 3 U.S. presidents. When will the government get serious on this issue? Or is this another Liberal broken promise?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me begin and state again unequivocally that the duties imposed by the U.S. on Canadian softwood lumber are unwarranted and unfair. We will always vigorously defend our softwood lumber industry and workers. We will do this through litigation, whether it is Chapter 19 in NAFTA or Chapter 10 of CUSMA, as well as at the WTO. I raise this issue at every opportunity. We will continue to work with the United States on this. And we've consistently said and reiterated that it is in the best interest of both countries to reach a negotiated settlement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Mr. Speaker, I'd say the Liberals are all talk and no action, but there's not even talk. On Friday, I questioned the Trade Minister where she was unable to say she had taken any action whatsoever to raise this issue with her U.S. counterparts. She cannot point to a single meeting or call that had taken place since the May 21st tariff increase announcement, despite claiming it was her top priority. When will the minister stand up for Canadians and start doing her job?
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, to the honourable member, this is a top priority for this government. I have raised this issue with the President, with the USTR, as well as with the Commerce Secretary. We have been working with Canadian industry, with Canadian labour, with the Canadian communities to which this issue impacts. I can assure you, Mr. Speaker, that I continue to vigorously defend the Canadian softwood lumber industry and the forestry sector, and we will continue to do this important work.
The honourable member for Repentigny. On April 22nd, Mr. Speaker, Ottawa announced new greenhouse gas reduction targets of between 40 and 45% by 2030. On the same day, the Bloc asked the government if it would include this target in Bill C-12, its own legislation. The Minister of Heritage promised they would. He said, yes, we will include Canada's 2030 climate change target in Bill C-12. But not only did his government not do that, and not only did he not tell the truth, they're also preventing the Bloc Québécois from including it for them. Why is that? The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The best available science tells us that we must achieve net zero emissions by 2050, and we're committed to meeting this target. With this legislation, we're enshrining into law the commitment. We will be strengthening the law to include a review in 2025 for our 2030 target, an interim emissions reduction for 2026, and enshrining the principle of progression of future targets. This legislation is a win for Canadians who expect their parliamentarians to have a real plan to fight climate change and build our economy. And we look forward to the Bloc supporting this legislation.
The honourable member for Repentigny. If the minister's so confident about his plan, why not put the targets in law? The government categorically refuses to commit to its own climate change commitments. That means that even today, its targets are as binding as a New Year's resolution. And so far, the federal government has never kept its resolutions. They failed to meet their Kyoto commitments in 2012. They failed to meet their Copenhagen commitments in 2015. They failed to meet the Paris interim targets in 2020. How can we trust their word if they refuse to enshrine their targets in law? The Honourable Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We flattened the curve on pollution, and the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act provides strong accountability and transparency mechanisms. The bill includes measures similar to the Bloc's Bill C-215, and several amendments already adopted by the committee address many of the Bloc's concerns. We await the outcome of the committee's work with great interest as we continue to move this important bill for Canadians and for future generations.
The honourable member for Repentigny. Mr. Speaker, in our current study, there are no targets currently in the legislation. The Heritage Minister made this promise in the House on April 22nd. He said, yes, we will put Canada's 2030 climate change target in Bill C-12. So he made a promise in the House on behalf of the government that is in direct contradiction to what the government is doing now by refusing to put that target into Bill C-12. He's made a promise to the people we represent that his government is now breaking. Will the Minister of Heritage apologize to the House and the people of Quebec? The Honourable Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act has robust accountability and transparency. Just to name a few aspects, it has a legally binding process for the federal government to set climate targets and bring forward plans to meet those targets. rigorous ongoing process reports, yearly reports by the independent advisory body, and ongoing audits by the Office of the Auditor General. As we have previously stated, we're open to amendments, and we're pleased to see members from the Bloc and NDP help move C12 to committee. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock.
Thank you, Speaker. When the Minister for Crown Indigenous Relations was asked why it took 2 years to release $27 million in previously announced funding to uncover what are believed to be thousands of Indigenous children buried in unmarked graves at residential schools across the country, the Minister said the communities weren't ready. Truth and Reconciliation Chair Murray Sinclair pointed out that even with limited research, they found several burial sites, yet nothing has been done by the government to follow that up. Speaker, why hasn't the money been made available until now?
Minister.
In memory of the children who went missing and in support of their grieving families and communities, we've provided $33.8 million in budget 2019 for the calls to action 72 to 76. The calls 72, 73 were through the National Center and Truth and Reconciliation to develop the registries on deaths and burials and cemeteries, and implementing calls to action 74 to 76. We are engaging with the communities on how to best support them in finding their lost children and how to access the $27 million.
The honourable member for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock.
Speaker, in committee, we heard from Ms. Wesley Esquimo of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, who called out the minister's comments that Indigenous peoples were not ready for that money. She stated that the minister's comments were simply untrue and that they've been working for many years and that the government has been told time and time again that the need for action is urgent. Speaker, in echoing TRC Commissioner Marie Wilson's comments last week, can the minister explain why it took the discovery of 215 children to elicit urgent action from the government?
Honourable Minister.
I thank the member for the question and the opportunity to explain the process since really the $10 million that went to the National Center on Truth and Reconciliation in 2016. We then had to move towards it with the NCTR, figure out what would be the appropriate amount for the 2019 budget. And then it was made clear to us that we had to engage with communities as to what would be the program design. And that meant that they wanted Indigenous-led, community-based, culturally sensitive as well as survivor-centric, and they wanted flexibility in the program. And that's exactly what we're being able to deliver now, and they will have access to it.
The honourable member for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock.
Speaker, within hours of the Truth and Reconciliation's report being released in December of 2015, the Prime Minister pledged to implement the calls to action. 6 years later, the government's own website, not updated since September of 2019, acknowledges a failure to get this done. Only a dozen of the 90-plus calls to action have been completed. When asked when they would be fulfilled, the minister would not offer a specific timeline. So will the minister promise right here to deliver a comprehensive plan to address the calls to action 71 through 76 by July 1st?
The honourable minister.
Well, firstly, I want to remind the member that over 80% of the 76 calls to action under the sole or shared responsibility of the federal government are completed or well underway. The recent passage of C5 is an example, C8, C15, we hope, and this will result in sustained and consistent action to advance Canada's shared journey of healing and reconciliation.
The honourable member for Nunavut.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister, the head of Canada, likes to use buzzwords like reconciliation to look good on the world stage without actually fulfilling basic human rights on Canadian soil. The Government of Canada destroyed records on residential schools, erasing vital information. The Catholic Church holds remaining records on these institutions. If Indigenous lives are so important as the Prime Minister likes to portray, why wouldn't he do everything in his power instead of taking knees and making apologies? Why won't this government force the Church to provide information that is rightfully ours?
The Honourable Minister.
I totally agree with the member that, except for the destruction of documents by the Canadian government, which were all handed over to the National Centre on Truth and Reconciliation, the residential school survivors and those dealing with it need to hear the Pope apologize, and explicitly for a Catholic Church's role in this tragedy, to unlock the healing and support closure. The Prime Minister formally requested an apology when he met with Pope Francis at the Vatican, and our government continues to call on the Pope to apologize and to release all relevant documents. The Pope's statement on Sunday doesn't go far enough.
The Honourable Member for Winnipeg Centre.
Mr. Speaker, it took 2 years after the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls for this government to release a national action plan without an implementation schedule. What Professor Pam Palmater has deemed, in quotes, code for we didn't come up with a plan, and Chief Judy Wilson of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs has called it another, in quotes, flowery reconciliation speeches that fall short in action, referring to it as a government delay tactic. Mr. Speaker, what date will the government release an implementation plan and finally act to end genocide against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit?
The Honourable Minister.
I thank the member for her ongoing advocacy, and our hearts are always with the survivors and the families of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirited LGBTQIA+ people. On June 3rd, we were, with all of the contributing partners across Canada, came together to release the National Action Plan and the federal pathway to finally end the ongoing tragedy. This is supported by Budget 2021, $2.2 billion over 5 years to implement the concrete measures that will truly keep Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirited LGBTQIA+ people safe.
The Honourable Member for West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country.
Mr. Speaker, the pandemic-related lockdown measures dealt a hard blow to the tourism and hospitality sector, the backbone of the economy of West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country. Small businesses throughout my riding have been clear that the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy has been a lifeline, without which they would have had to close their doors for good. As restrictions on gathering are lifted and our economy can safely reopen, businesses are planning to hire more staff and do their part in creating good-paying middle-class jobs. Can the minister share what this government is doing to support them?
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleague from West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country, for his question and his strong advocacy for small businesses. We've been there for businesses every step of the way in this pandemic. And on the road to recovery, we're investing $600 million with the Canada Recovery Hiring Program. This will help businesses hire new workers, hire back workers, or increase the hours and wages of existing workers and support a quicker recovery. We're going to continue to be there for Canadian businesses and workers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, I ask this question yet again. President Biden ordered U.S. intelligence to investigate two likely theories on the origin of the coronavirus. One, that it originated from human contact with an infected animal, and the other, that it came from a lab accident at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The government says it supports the U.S. investigation. Given that government scientists at the Winnipeg lab worked closely with the Wuhan lab, will U.S. investigators have access to these government scientists and their relevant documents, including lab notes?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my colleague for the question. And as he rightly pointed out, we support President Biden's call to fully investigate the origin of the COVID virus using the best science and information available. And we in Canada will help in any way we can.
Member for Wellington, Halton Hills.
Well, Mr. Speaker, perhaps the government can start helping by answering questions that we have been asking about the national security breaches at the Winnipeg lab. Clearly, there were breaches, and we need answers. When will it start answering the questions we are asking, such as why were the two government scientists fired from the Winnipeg lab? Where are these two government scientists? How did a Chinese military scientist get access to this top-level lab in Winnipeg? And were there any unauthorized transfers of materials from Winnipeg to Wuhan?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I have written to the chair of the NSI COP committee to refer this issue to the appropriate place to study these questions. As well, the agency has provided the committee the unredacted documents through the clerk, the House clerk. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, Canada had an agreement with China that allowed Dr. Q to share information and virus samples with the Wuhan Virology Institute, but 2 months after Dr. Q coordinated sending several viruses to China, including Ebola, she was escorted out of the lab and the RCMP began an investigation. It's clear that the termination of the doctor was for a reason that was much more serious than sending a virus. In compliance with established protocol, Canadians want to know, why did the Prime Minister hide the truth? The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, on the contrary, as that member opposite probably just heard, I have written to the chair of the NSI COP committee, which is the appropriate level of security to review items of national security. I've referred this issue to the chair. As well, the agency has provided the unredacted documents to the House clerk to work with that committee. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, I understand the minister is trying to move over to the committee, NSI COP, but it's not a committee of parliament. Now, China stole Canadian intellectual property through CanSino in vaccine development, and now it's attacking our top secret labs. So when the recipients in Beijing got the virus shipped by Dr. Q on April 1st, 2019, they sent a message in particular to Dr. Q saying, we look forward to future cooperation. If this cooperation already existed, why would they talk about it? The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, researchers across the country have been working together and indeed with other international researchers to understand COVID-19, to develop vaccines, to create testing and screening equipment and understand the virus as it evolves. As the member knows, in this particular situation, these researchers are no longer with the lab. And in fact, the director of the lab has been very clear that there's no connection with their departure in COVID-19. I think it's irresponsible of the member to try and draw that link. I have referred this item to the appropriate committee with the appropriate level of security to review the documents.
The Honourable Member for Drummond. 30 years, Mr. Speaker, 30 years since the last update on the Broadcasting Act. Before social networks, the web giants, 1991, it was like a horror film. The internet was very slow, and pagers were more popular than cell phones. It's been 30 years. And conservatives were still calling themselves progressives. Does the Minister of Heritage believe that we have the luxury of waiting months to pass C-10 to finally modernize the Broadcasting Act? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague for his question. And the answer to his question is quite simple. No, we have no more time to waste with the passage of C-10. Every month that passes deprives our artists, musicians, technicians of $70 million for every month that we waste. We must pass C-10 as quickly as possible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Drummond. Mr. Speaker, the member for Lethbridge told an Alberta newspaper that artists in Quebec supported the Bill C-10 because they are stuck in the past and reliant on government grants because they are not able to make a living off what they are producing, like their films don't interest Canadians, Mr. Speaker. Timid excuses on Twitter, but it's not enough. Will the minister join his voice to ours in condemning these ignorant comments that demonstrate a complete lack of knowledge about Quebec culture and despicable contempt for Quebec creators, and ask the Leader of the Official Opposition to apologize for what his member has said? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I quite agree with my honourable colleague. The comments made by the member for Lethbridge are unacceptable. She must apologize in the House. And the Leader of the Official Opposition must also apologize in the House. I'd be curious to know whether, based on her criteria, if if she understands that there are artists that are beating records every day and doing great productions. It's unacceptable. The member for Lethbridge and the leader of the official opposition must apologize.
The honourable member for Lambton, Kent, Middlesex.
Speaker, the government consultation period for the Canada Grains Act ended on April 30th. My colleagues and I have heard from many stakeholders who participated in the consultations. On May 13th, I sent the Minister of Agriculture a letter asking and explaining that stakeholders are frustrated because of the lack of information available to them regarding the government's next steps. Mr. Speaker, when will this government tell the stakeholders what the plan is and a timeline for releasing the results of the consultation?
Honourable Minister.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would remind my colleague that we conducted an in-depth consultation with entrepreneurs across the country and that we had an excellent response. The department is working on drafting the report, which will summarize all those consultations, and we must continue our studies because we want to make recommendations that will be based on conclusive data. This is a priority for us to review this legislation. The honourable member for Beauce. Mr. Speaker, for a month now, I sent a letter signed by 14 companies in my region to the Minister of Immigration condemning the endless delays and red tape dealing with foreign workers. We're talking about landscapers, welders, mechanics, machinists, and they don't know where to turn to move things forward. It's like their last chance is Santa Claus. Who at least answers all these questions? Will the minister finally do something to help these companies? The honourable minister. Mr. Speaker, we're on the right track to meet the targets set by Quebec in 2021, and this includes the family class and even temporary foreign workers. We have also added resources. We introduced policies to show our progress in our work. I will continue to work with my colleagues in order to ensure that they can get all the immigrants they need. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member for Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier. Mr. Speaker, the end of the pandemic is in sight and thousands of businesses want to take part in the economic recovery. Unfortunately, this Liberal government isn't able to find solutions to help these men and women who want to save their businesses by hiring foreign workers. Beyond statistics and the lengthy wait times, can this government do what is needed to grant access rapidly to laborers and support our brave Canadian entrepreneurs? The honourable minister. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the member opposite for that important question. We have already admitted 8,500 qualified workers in Quebec this year, 1,000 foreign workers. Not only will we meet the targets set by the government of Quebec in 2021, but we will also recover from the pandemic. We continue to work in collaboration with the government of Quebec in order to support the economic recovery. The honourable member for Lac-Saint-Louis. Mr. Speaker, be it whether a hike in nature or a walk in a park, our green spaces improve our well-being, our mental health, and allow us to escape our daily lives. Our forests also give us many environmental benefits, such as improving biodiversity and carbon capture. Can the Minister of Natural Resources inform the House of the progress accomplished by our government in achieving our ambitious commitment to plant 2 billion trees over the next 10 years? The honourable minister.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleague for the question. There is no possibility of achieving net zero emissions without our forests. Last Friday, I announced that over 30 million trees would be planted by the end of the year. Trees are already in the ground. We are building forests, new and permanent forests, enough to cover an area twice the size of Prince Edward Island. They are absorbing and stocking carbon and creating thousands of jobs. Mr. Speaker, today we are sowing the seeds for a better future. Thank you.
The honourable member for Chatham, Kent, Leamington.
Canada's internet costs are among the highest in the world and one of the few countries where they continue to rise. On May 27th, the CRTC reversed its own decision to reduce the broadband access costs from the large telecoms to the smaller internet service providers like TechSavvy, headquartered in Chatham. Whereas the railway secured Canada's future 136 years ago, Canadians need reliable, reasonably priced access to broadband to secure our future today. Minister, is the government breaking its own promise to reduce rates, or what is the plan?
The Honourable Member for Saskatoon West. The Honourable Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would say to the Honourable Member, we share the same goals. The goals of affordability, the goals of competition, the goal of innovation. That's why we have been relentless, Mr. Speaker, in promoting competition to lower prices while working to improve quality and increase the coverage of telecom services across our nation. As he knows, we're ensuring that Canadians pay affordable prices for reliable internet services, regardless of where they live in our nation. And Mr. Speaker, every time I had a call with telecom companies or internet service provider, I always push for better outcome for consumers and lower prices, and I will continue to do that.
The Honourable Member for Saskatoon West.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberal Bloc coalition cutting off debate on their internet censorship bill is an act of cowardice by this government. They're doing this because they're afraid of the public backlash against going down in history as the government that trampled over Pierre Trudeau's Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In my riding of Saskatoon West, constituents have made it clear that they do not want this Prime Minister to censor their social media posts. Mr. Speaker, Bill C-10 will censor Canadians' Facebook and TikTok posts. Will the government do the courageous thing, reverse course, and stop Bill C-10?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, according to the member for Lethbridge, and I quote, arts fund actually goes toward a very niche group of artists that are stuck in the early 90s because they haven't managed to be competitive on a new platform. She also added, and I quote, these artists are not able to make a living off what they're producing, so they require grants that are given by the government. So I would like to know if a series like Heartland, in its 15th season, filmed in Alberta, is one of those outdated series. Or perhaps the member would wish to comment on Schitt's Creek, a winner of 9 Emmys, is also one of those series that is stuck in the early 90s because they haven't managed to be competitive on the new platforms. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for South Surrey, White Rock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's being reported that more than half of the $2.9 billion Canadian emergency student benefit funds went to those in households with more than $100,000 in annual income. Supporting young Canadians, a group that's been particularly hard hit by this pandemic, is critical. It's also this younger generation that will be paying off this government's record-breaking debt for decades and decades. So why not targeted relief to the students who need it the most?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, over 700,000 students got help through the Canada Emergency Student Benefit last year. And just last week, Stats Can released a report saying that our lower wage workers, women, and racialized Canadians were all supported at rates higher than their counterparts. Mr. Speaker, we put forth a $7.2 billion package of measures for students last summer. We added $4.7 billion of support last year in the fall economic statement, and we've added more support this year in budget 2021. We'll be there for students, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Sydney, Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, despite only making up 4% of the population, Indigenous women and girls represented 28% of the homicides perpetuated against women in 2019. 2 years ago, the National Inquiry for Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls released their final report and calls for justice, which called for a national action plan to end the violence. Last week, contributing partners from across Canada came together to release that national action plan. Can the minister update the House on the federal component of that action plan?
Honourable Minister.
I thank the member for his exemplary leadership, and we honor the strength and resilience of the families and survivors for their decades of advocacy for justice, healing, and prevention. The federal pathway is a key contribution to the National Action Plan that will lead to lasting and transformative change. It outlines the concrete actions to end systemic racism, sexism, ableism, and economic inequality, root causes of violence against Indigenous women and girls, and to us LGBTQIA+ people who deserve to feel safe wherever they live.
The honourable member for Esquimalt Saanich-Sooke.
Mr. Speaker, members of the Canadian Forces strive every day to uphold the highest standards when it comes to military conduct, and Canadians trust that they will always do so. But we've seen repeated failures of senior leaders to uphold those same standards, whether we're talking about sexual misconduct, the torture of detainees transferred into local custody in Afghanistan, or now the failure to report possible war crimes by Iraqi troops Canadians were supposed to be training. Will the Minister of Defense break this pattern of looking the other way when it comes to human rights violations? And will he now order an independent inquiry into the failure to report possible war crimes in both Iraq and Afghanistan?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we're absolutely committed to making sure that we respect human rights and international law in all our operations. Training is always done for our members, and any unit that our members train go through some rigorous training. Every situation like this is rigorously looked at, and the current allegations are currently being looked at by the military police. Thank you.
The honourable member for Fredericton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The current generation of youth grew up being acutely aware of the urgency to fight the climate crisis and the multitude of challenges facing our planet, from deforestation to environmental racism, including the pollution generated by plastic waste. Youth around the world have united. Through their protests, they are educating us. But most importantly, they're demanding actions and they expect accountability. They won a glimpse of hope when the German High Court handed them a victory and ordered the government to expand its plan to reduce carbon emissions to zero by 2050 and required lawmakers to make long-term climate commitments. Mr. Speaker, will the government demonstrate that Canada is learning from this legal precedent and commit to achieving its 2030 climate goals? Will it formally recognize the right for this generation and the next
Honourable Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the honourable member for her continued climate advocacy and passion on the file. We have a bold and ambitious plan to protect our environment, reduce emissions, and create a sustainable economy for our kids and grandkids. In fact, the former leader of the BC Green Party and leading climate change scientist Andrew Weaver called our pollution pricing plan the gold standard, and described our plan as an innovative and inspiring climate plan. And Mr. Speaker, we agree. Thank you so much.
The honourable member for Vancouver Grenville.
In 2020, the UN Secretary General noted that the, quote, approach to and handling of mass graves has too rarely been respectful or lawful. Canada has